We all share humanity, whatever our color, whatever our faith, whatever our education. We are all human beings. If one suffers, all should suffer. Man is not an island, as John Donne said. But beyond that, there is that enormous interdependence, that there's a moral independence. If one person, like a Sakharov, suffers the lack of freedom, we ought to all suffer the lack of freedom. There is a continuity in our history and in our relation to each other. And there it is, if 100 million people not very far away are hungry, we ought to do something about it. We're capable of it, but instead we are caught up with the foolishness of fighting each other rather than helping each other.
Please welcome Notre Dame Associate Professor of the Practice of Conflict Transformation and Peacebuilding, David Anderson Hooker.
Good afternoon. Welcome back. You heard that I'm a professor of the practice of peace building and conflict transformation, which means that I'm doing the work all the time. And so over the 35 years of my practice, I have primarily focused on conflict transformation, community building, and peace building, where there has been violence or where there still is direct violence, structural violence, cultural violence present. And what I've learned is that primarily the best way to understand people's lives and the best way to understand the systems that regulate people's lives is to understand the stories and the narratives that shape their life. And so I work with groups to help construct and reconstruct stories and narratives of a preferred future. My work has taken me all across, as you can imagine. I've been in Nigeria and Cuba and Zimbabwe and spending a lot of time these days in South Sudan and Somalia. But what I really wanted to talk to you about today is a really exciting piece of peace building that's happening much closer by, in Chicago. I am excited to be a board member of the Chicago Torture Justice Center. Some people, when they're writing it, they'll say CTJC, and I try not to do that. I don't want to abbreviate it because I don't want us to lose track of what we're actually talking about. Chicago Torture Justice Center. Anticipating one of your questions, why would we ever need one of those in Chicago? There's the Marjorie Kovler Center, and there's another center in Minnesota for the support of victims of torture. But those are both centers that address torture that people experienced in other countries, and then they come to the United States seeking asylum and refuge. Just the fact that there are those two centers in the Midwest and a dozen other centers around the country that are in high demand suggests that we have to rethink whether and how we close our eyes, close our hearts, and close our borders to people who are seeking asylum and refuge in this country. But this is the Chicago Torture Justice Center. So why would we need one of those? Let me tell you what happened. Between 1972 and 1991, Commander John Burge and those detectives under his authority used torturous techniques and practices that Burge had learned while he was a military police officer during Operation Phoenix in the Vietnam War. And they used those techniques to extract confessions from people that were then sentenced to prison based on those confessions, and some of them spent 5, 10, as much as 30 years in prison, and there were several that were even sentenced to receive the death penalty under the state of Illinois law. Burge, some of you, let me anticipate one of your questions. One of your questions might be, would these people ever confess if they weren't guilty? I don't know. What I know is that most of us have no earthly idea what we would do if we were locked in isolation, we're being yelled at, we were being beat around our head with phone books, if we were having a shock box attached to our body, that we were having an electric cattle prod stuck in our genital areas, if we were being suffocated, and if we experienced mock execution where there was either a shotgun put in our mouth or a revolver put to our head and the trigger pulled several times, most of us have no earthly idea what we would do or say to get out of that condition. But it almost doesn't matter whether their confessions were true or false, because it still impacts our personal identity and our national identity. How does it do that? How does it impact our personal identity? What is the narrative that you tell yourself about the country you live in and the role of the rule of law and justice? Most of us think that that narrative is shaped by the founding documents, including the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, which would suggest that when torture was used to extract confessions, our national identity was at stake. How so? There were unwarranted searches and seizures as prohibited by the Fourth Amendment. People were denied their right to avoid self-incrimination under the Fifth Amendment. They were denied the right to either a jury trial or to confront their accusers as provided by the Sixth Amendment, which obviates the value of a federal jury trial as provided by the Seventh Amendment. They were exposed to cruel and unusual punishment as prohibited by the Eighth Amendment, and because when they were put to jail, they were put in that loophole of the 13th Amendment, which allows enslavement. If you ever get a chance to go back and read after the comma in the 13th Amendment, it says we abolish slavery except if we can send them to prison, and then they can be forced into uncompensated labor and into conditions of confinement that are equivalent to slavery. My colleague Doug Blackman, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning text, Slavery by Another Name, which was also made into a documentary, and Professor Michelle Alexander both describe this context really well. Anticipating your question, how could this have possibly lasted so long? You said almost 20 years. How could this possibly have lasted so long? Because immediately when this started happening, the mothers, the aunties, the relatives, the friends, social organizations were crying out for relief. So how could it have lasted for 20 years? They experienced what Professor Miranda Fricker would call epistemic injustice. It's like this. Some aspect of your identity makes your testimony less credible, makes your opinion less valuable. It would be if you were a community psychologist hoping to have your opinion valued in a conversation with a group of psychiatrists. You may not necessarily fully appreciate that one, but let me try a different one. It would be if a Stanford alum or a University of Michigan alum was asked to be the commentator for a Notre Dame football game. We tend to not believe what they say. We're going to listen to what they say and be a little suspect. But those are just circumstantial cases where they're experiencing epistemic injustice. The people who were advocating on behalf of these torture victims were experiencing a permanent and durable epistemic injustice. They had limited testimonial authority because they were poor, black, brown-bodied, mostly women who were arguing on behalf of their sons and husbands. They were from the south side of Chicago, and the people that they were advocating on behalf of were not people that most of us admire or concern ourselves with, and so they were allowed, for 20 years, this episode was allowed to continue. That has something to do, or it should have something to do, with our national identity. All of the nuances, details, I can't tell you all of that. So let me just give it to you in broad strokes, very broad strokes. Even when they were protesting, nobody seemed to care. But these are the broad numbers. 20 years of torture, denial, complicity. More than 120 people, at least 120 people that we've been able to get out of prison so far because of torture confessions. $132 million, that's the number of dollars that were spent on the Burge victims of torture. And I emphasize the Burge victims of torture because sometime later there was a report that said that between August of 2004 and June 2015, these same police forces disappeared more than 7,000 people, which means that they were held incommunicado without, except for 68 of them, without access to their attorney for hours, days, months, with no public notice of their whereabouts. But the biggest, the most tragic number in all of this is 0. 0 is the number of people who were held criminally accountable for those actions. Even after the coroner said that there's obviously been torture, even after We Charge Genocide, Amnesty International, the People's Law Group, all staked claims, 0 people were held accountable. Burge was tried for perjury and obstruction of justice. He spent a few years in prison, but don't worry, if you have a level of empathy for him, I can appreciate that. He got out, retired with a full pension, and was allowed to live comfortably in Florida until he passed sometime last year. So that's the most difficult number. But in May 2015, we finally were able to pass a historic Reparations Ordinance, and in that ordinance, it provided for the creation of a center to provide specified relief. So it's the first in the country to provide relief to people who have experienced racially motivated violence at the hand of law enforcement. We've also there's a small budget for artistic remembrance and the creation of a curriculum so that this issue and this episode can continue to be taught in schools and it won't be forgotten. So I am proud to be part of an organization that's committed to holding people to account and committed to constructing a narrative where everybody, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, gender conformity, citizenship status, everybody has rights to the relationships, resources, and structures that they need to survive, to thrive, and to manifest their full capabilities. If we lived in such a world already, I submit to you that the abuses that happened at Michigan State and the Ohio State would not have happened, or they would not have extended as long as they did. If we lived in such a world already, I submit to you that the Catholic Church wouldn't be in the pickle that it's in right now. If we lived in such a world, Andean Health, immigrant assistance, and the Chicago Torture Justice Center would be absolutely unnecessary. But we don't live there yet. So this is the thing for you. Most of you will never be victims. Most of you will never be perpetrators of torture. But that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is that there are 2 positions left. If you're not victim, you're not perpetrator, you're either going to be a bystander or you're going to bear witness. Father Ted said, if we're ever to achieve justice, we have to recognize our moral interconnectedness. Martin King described it as being connected in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Nelson Mandela says that in order to be free, we have to not just cast off our chains, but we have to create conditions in which others are likely to also experience freedom. And even Jesus, on the night that he was about to die, being executed by state authority, while a lot of bystanders stood around, he prayed in his last prayer that we would acknowledge our oneness and that we would live in a way that recognized our connection and our interconnection to the other. I've been trying to anticipate your questions. I wonder if you've been anticipating mine. My question is this: are you willing to organize your life and your life story in a way that bears witness to the possibility of dignity, even liberty, and justice for all? I hope so. Every morning I pray so. Ashe, 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 oh. Thank you.